It's a command that defined an era. A word no longer recognized as just a fashion magazine, Madonna's 1990 single, Vogue, reshaped the cultural landscape, reaching the #1 spot in over 30 countries and selling over 6 million copies worldwide. Yet, beneath the punchy syncopation lies a tension that the charts were unable to quantify. Having stemmed from a subculture of dance choreographed by the outcasts and the underprivileged, the song may have never been Madonna's to make.
Strike a pose.
The lyrics of Vogue, as noted by Matthew Rettenman in his book Encyclopedia Madonnica, attempt to baptize the dance floor as a place where no boundaries exist. He describes the dance floor as a place where rebirth is possible, where new life based on gesticulation can replace motionless and emotionless reality, and anyone can become, if only for the duration of a song or of one's stamina, a superstar. There's a constant theme of escapism in the notion of becoming a more glamorous version of yourself within the song, and Madonna sells a pretty specific promise with the lyrics. These lines make it clear that Madonna believes in the dance floor as a sacred space, as Peter Opposson claims. However, this view of the dance floor as an idyllic escape reveals the song's fundamental tension. For the privileged pop star, the dance floor is a place to get away from boredom or heartache, but for the queer, largely black and Latino youth who created voguing, it's a simulation of the privilege they're often denied. Voguing grew inside the minoritarian public sphere known as ballroom, a structure of houses that acted as families and a language of shade for queer people of color in New York, primarily Harlem. It was a subcultural practice that served as a micro-political haven amidst the AIDS epidemic. By the late 80s, voguing was unavoidable in downtown Manhattan's nightlife, a scene Madonna had already conquered. She recalls her first encounter with the dance form at the Sound Factory, a notable dance club in Soho that opened in 1989. There, she met ballroom legends Louis and Jose Extravaganza, who she later hired to choreograph Vogue's music video. It's also suggested that Vogue may have been born out of Madonna's 1989 attendance at Suzanne Barch's Love Ball. A key figure in downtown Manhattan's nightlife, Barch brought together fashion's most renowned artists and introduced them to the world of ballroom through a benefit for AIDS research. It wasn't until this collision of fashion and ballroom that voguing fell into the hands of the mainstream, traveling further downtown and out of the hands of its originators. Although voguing had been recontextualized, in Barch's case, it still maintained some of its foundation, to uplift a community that needed hope in a moment of crisis. It's hard to say that Madonna's take on voguing had the same intentionality.
I think it has a lot of humor to it too. I mean, it's just so sort of arrogant and there and presentational, you know what I mean? Self-conscious in a way, and I think it's hilarious. I really do.
It's easy, then, to view Madonna's interpretation of voguing as a glamorized, black and white remove from its original sources. But to view this solely as erasure ignores the active political context in which she was operating. Choreographer Jose Extravaganza defended the global exposure Madonna provided to voguing, noting, "This is a very jaded community. It's very territorial. The song was #1 and it was on rotation on MTV. It was all you heard. It had hit the mainstream, you know, the straights." She had basically taken it from underground gay ballroom culture and brought it mainstream. The community, as much as they loved that, they also started to say that she stole it or that she was trying to take credit for it. I always say that if she had not given it that platform, it would not be where it is today. You have to think that, at the time, no one was touching the gay community. It was the early 90s, and AIDS had hit hard. This woman was, in her own way, being an advocate and an activist. It was her homage to the community. She didn't steal it, she did it with us. Me, Louis, we are from ballroom. It was a critical moment for the ballroom community. Following the release of Vogue, Suzanne Barch hosted the second iteration of her Love Ball, raising over $2.5 million with both events for AIDS research. As Myra Lewis, a founding member of the House of Field, recalls, "Our friends were also dying of AIDS. It was devastating. But we found safety in each other. That's why balls are sacred. We were celebrating because we didn't know how long anyone would be here." Vogue's release also coincided with the release of Paris is Burning, a documentary capturing the reality of poverty, found family, and beauty within the ball scene amidst the developing AIDS epidemic in 80s New York.
Voguing came from shade because it was a dance that two people did because they didn't like each other. Instead of fighting, you would dance it out on the dance floor, and whoever did the better moves was throwing the best shade, basically.
The name was taken from the magazine Vogue,
because some of the movements of the dance are also the same as the poses inside the magazine.
The sequential release of Vogue and Paris is Burning unleashed an international Vogue craze of epic proportions. Ballroom culture had been Miramaxed and reached its peak of mainstream visibility. However, the tides quickly turned, and many continue to see this wave as an example of commercialization instead of appreciation. In a 2015 article responding to this rapid shift in the scene, author Benji Hart critiques, "Voguing is a tool we created, not merely for expression, but for organizing, empowering, surviving the daily violence of a white supremacist society." To Hart's point, the film frames its subjects in a world dominated by white standards.
This is white America. That is why in the ballroom circuit, it is so obvious that if you have captured the great white way of living or looking or dressing or speaking, you is a marvel.
When the means for survival that Hart describes are exported to American suburbia, it risks becoming a dance form with no movement. In his 1993 New York Times article, Paris Has Burned, Jesse Green argues that the mainstream attention actually depleted the subculture's vitality. He notes, "No one needs to go to a ball to see voguing either. Not since Madonna gobbled up this stylized, slow-motion dancing, appropriating two extravaganzas in the process. Once mainstream America began to copy a subculture that was copying it, the subculture itself was no longer of interest to a wider audience, and whatever new opportunities existed for the principles dried up." However, pinning the entire legacy of Vogue to the concept of cultural appropriation may be too reductive. While labeling the song as appropriative accurately identifies the power imbalance, it limits the conversation to a matter of who does and does not have the right to profit, ignoring the cultural hybridization inherent in popular culture. It is not a new conversation, but it's still a complicated one. We've seen this recycling before in the appropriation of jazz music and watched it unfold again as rap music sampled from across the musical genres, both insisting upon a sense of referentiality that its audiences may find difficult to trace. As we ask of both genres, where did that sequence of chords come from, and what culture inspired this varying downbeat, we may also want to ask of voguing, who did that pose first, and where did this ball chant originate? The key issue is, as we've seen presented again in the co-optation of predominantly black art forms, is the issue of origins. Specifically, where can we draw the divide between borrowing and appropriating? In Madonna's case, it was not merely an issue of profit, but rather that the art form is disassociated from its cultural origins altogether. Ballroom, if anything, is far more than just voguing. It's built largely on the impersonation of American glamour and status. There is a distinct irony here. A subculture dedicated to flawless impersonation of the mainstream elite eventually became the subject of that elite's impersonation. To this extent, Vogue demonstrates that appropriation is something of a double-edged sword. Marlon T. Riggs came to terms with this paradox in his film Tongues Untied.
Ironic that dance, my ticket to assimilation, my way of amusing, then winning acceptance by whites. How many of us have followed that the same steps were now my passage back home.
The ballroom community's impersonation of white American privilege was a necessary practice, a form of armor designed to secure mainstream acceptance, access, and often safety in a society that denied them these things. Why, then, when Madonna made her, albeit minimizing attempt at voguing to further her mainstream popularity, was it met with such enduring controversy? The answer lies in the vast imbalance of power and consequence. The ballroom community risked their lives in bringing their culture to the main stage. Madonna risked nothing but a possible dip in her popularity. That, of course, was not the case, but it certainly didn't stop her from disposing of the dance form and the community tied to it to make room for her next, far more conservative rebrand. And so the story goes. By the mid to late 90s, ball culture had been reduced to yet another dancing fad, tossed into the pile alongside the Macarena, the Moonwalk, and the Charleston. Ironically, this was actually the moment in which voguing became the stylized, high-energy dance form we understand it as today. Voguing diverged, broadly speaking, into two main categories: the old way and the new way, distinguished by their relation to tempo and the inclusion of full-body dramatics, no longer just the arms and the wrists. Struggling to stay afloat amidst the commodification of white, cis-centered models and pop stars, a new generation of voguers began to gesture with newfound stamina, falling into dips, splits, and kicks that were hard to look away from. This is the generation of ballroom that I was first introduced to. I saw it in Beyoncé's Renaissance tour, whose ensemble of dancers included a mix of ballroom and non-ballroom performers. I saw it again with F.K. Twigs' Sushi, and most recently in Broadway's revival of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats. I recently attended a talkback of Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning, in which Bill Rauch, one of the Tony Award-winning directors of the reimagined Cats, participated alongside Livingston herself. The discussion was moderated by Michael Robertson, a multifaceted advocate and figure within the ball community. The conversation quickly turned to address the fact that both Livingston and Rauch are cisgendered and white, not to mention that the majority of the crowd, myself included, were film buffs of the same racial and gender status. There's a point to be made that Livingston's documentary may have never received the funding or attention it has without there being a white person at the helm. The same goes for Rauch, especially considering the major investments required to greenlight a Broadway production. Robertson had previously addressed this outsider narrative that threads the 30-year gap between Paris is Burning, Vogue, and Cats in an interview with Vogue magazine. He says, "In the 1990s, Paris is Burning comes out, Madonna comes out, and we're like, oh, we're gonna make it. Here's the interesting thing about being underground. There's a desire to some degree to keep it underground, but also to a large degree a desire to be seen and to be visible." Benji Hart argues for the former desire, saying in their article that, instead of expert Voguers taking pride in passing on their knowledge to the young oppressed people most in need of it, new generations of our community are abandoned for the notoriety of white, wealthy, straight, cis patronage. Hart seems to argue that in almost any respect, taking voguing and hoisting it to the mainstream media is, in fact, appropriation, because, as Hart says, cis people, straight people, wealthy people, even those who share some of our other oppressed identities, still desecrate our art and our community when they objectify our aesthetic, without taking on accountability for the ways they benefit from the violence we face at the hands of the systems that are cutting their checks. Robertson recalls the discourse that follows Hart's article, much of which divided the modern ballroom community on monetization rights. Robertson understands both sides with the essential knowledge that, quote, you can't tell somebody what to do with their talent. Even then, some saw this commercial output as a giving away to general audiences, the very same argument that was made amidst the appropriation of jazz and blues, risking to become something else entirely. Empress Chastity Moore, a trans woman and ballroom legend, who plays Grisabella in Rauch's production of Cats, noted her concern regarding the production's possible appropriation. "I was very concerned about appropriation. We, in ballroom, were such an underground, and now it's become mainstream. You see a lot of people going, ballroom this, ballroom that, I'm throwing a ball, and they don't know the background, or you don't see people from ballroom in it. They were very open to what we had to say about ballroom, and what happens and doesn't happen in it. When you have major people from ballroom in it, I no longer really had to worry about appropriation. But the feedback has been really good in ballroom. That's a tough crowd, and they are loving it." In these conversations, it is regarded as though representation and appropriation live on opposite sides of the same spectrum. The question, then, is whether Vogue itself can be relocated on that spectrum, or whether the terms of its release permanently settled its position 30 years ago. To answer this question, let us return to voguing in its first iterations, a rhythmic posing intended to signal shade to its recipient, and to re-establish a sense of glamour or status within the poser. In its most basic form, to vogue is to pose. Craig Owens places posing in a key cultural position in his book, Beyond Recognition, Representation, Power, and Culture. Posing, he claims, is both a matter of social and psychosexual exchange. He defines it as a presentation of oneself to the gaze of the other, as if one were already frozen, immobilized, that is, already a picture. He borrows Jacques Lacan's idea of this strategic posing as pseudo-identification, renaming it the Medusa effect, which places the viewer, too, at a standstill, immobile and under the control of the poser. It is a threatening act, as he reiterates, quote, to strike a pose is to pose a threat. The Vogue video enacts this literally. Madonna and her dancers freeze in a sequence of tableau. It is formally an act of posing in Owen's exact sense, the body presented to the camera as if already a picture. But before a pose can be deemed strategic or threatening, Owens lists many things that are essential. Specular ruse, imaginary identification of seer and scene, immediacy, capture, and most crucially, stereotype. Posing, as he puts it, is and always has been a mirror image of social reality. He employs the pawn to clarify the position in which stereotypes play within posing. Whenever we are dealing with imitation, we should be very careful not to think too quickly of the other who is being imitated. To imitate is no doubt to reproduce an image, but at bottom it is for the subject to be inserted in a function whose exercise grasps it. Ballroom is the pivotal example of Lacan's point. The visual signifiers of wealth and status were placed in hands that previously had been deprived of both. The movements, outfits and vocabulary of that status were inserted into function, ballroom, whose exercise, voguing, appreciated them far better than a wealthy white patron may be able to herself. This is largely because that patron or pop star had never had to want them. The connection between Lacan's philosophical theory and ballroom is a far-reaching one. It may even be an impossible connection to make, if not for Owen's inclusion of Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, where he places the final responsibility on us, the audience, as he says, "A text is made in multiple writings, drawn from many cultures and entering into multiple relation of dialogue, parody, contestation, but there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author." It is for us, the viewer, to notice Willie Ninja's miming of a makeup kit, then the turning of that compact mirror towards ourselves to see that we may need a dramatic makeup job, or to recognize that the snap of a finger combined with a rapid flick of a wrist means don't mess with a snap diva. But it is also for us to heed when the same gestures, performed by someone else, stop pointing anywhere. Madonna's choreography is legible as style, elegant, referential, occasionally funny, as Madonna herself says, but they don't point anywhere specific. The shade has nowhere to land. For ballroom's language of gesture to remain intact, it must be accurately represented, spoken with a poise and clarity that reminds us of the glamour under which it originated. That is why accurate representation, as Owens puts it, is not, nor can it be, neutral. It is an act, indeed, the founding act, of power in our culture. This is why the imbalanced power that Madonna held when recoining Vogue placed her at the latter part of my spectrum, appropriation. Despite her inclusion of ballroom dancers and advocacy for the broader queer community, her reimagining of the subculture misarticulated the vocabulary at the core of ballroom's legacy. A gesture can be reproduced with total accuracy and still be deprived of what made it dangerous. The only thing that may be for certain here is that ballroom is changing, just as society's acceptance of queer people is changing, unevenly and incompletely. Ballroom has always been a language, even in its earliest iterations, built by people who needed a vocabulary that the world hadn't afforded them. Languages survive by being spoken, aloud, by more people, but they also risk mistranslation. Words become flattened, mispronounced, and stripped of the history that gave those words weight in the first place. The task, 30 years after Vogue, isn't to decide once and for all who's allowed to speak, or to strike a pose for that matter. It's to keep asking who's being credited, who's being paid, and who's being protected, even when, and especially when, the cameras and the charts have moved on.
Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing